about the lachesis. Lachesis is a homeopathic remedy. But first of all, I want to speak about the core delusion because it is very important in homeopathy practice. And as far as I'm concerned, Dr. Luc de Schepper is the only one who teaches this. And I really think it is a very important point in understanding the human. And in homeopathy, we treat the human firstly. That is all that matters. And that is why I want to start with paragraph 153 from the Organon, and then we can read this. Quote, in this search for a homeopathic specific remedy, that is to say, in this comparison of the collective symptoms of the natural disease with the list of symptoms of known medicines, in order to find among these an artificial morbific agent corresponding by similarity to the disease to be cured, the most striking, singular, uncommon and peculiar signs and symptoms of the case of disease are chiefly and most solely to be kept in view. For it is more particularly these as very similar ones in the list of symptoms of the selected medicine must correspond to, in order to constitute it the most suitable for effecting the cure. The more general and undefined symptoms, like loss of appetite, headache, debility, restless sleep, discomfort, and so forth, demand but little attention when of that vague and indefinite character, if they cannot be more accurately described as symptoms of such a general nature are observed in almost every disease and from almost every drug. And I will return to that paragraph later on. But now, let me tell you that according to Carl Jung, delusions are fixed ideas, and they are created by unresolved and long-lasting painful events. They always contain a kernel of truth, if you like. So, many of our delusions stem from unrealistic and exaggerated expectations. And they're created by aiming for things that are out of our reach, by underestimating difficulties, by having unjustified optimism, or just by being overly anxious, jealous, greedy, egotistical. And among all the delusions patients present before us, there is one that started the whole process, and that is called the core delusion. Jung also called it the primal delusion, the archaic delusion, the original delusion. And the core delusion is the source of all subsequent delusions or fixed ideas which are created along the road because the patient received inadequate or no therapy. So the core delusion is the center point, the nucleus of the beginning of the story. And that is very important to be stressed. The core delusion indicates the remedy our patient needs. So, discovering the core delusion will be an important step, not only in formulating and understanding the crux of the patient's suffering, but also in finding the similar remedy that will free him from his illness. And also, the core delusion will be the homeopath's tool when differentiating between 2 or 3 remedies at the end of the consultation. That is why the correct interpretation of the core delusion must match the secondary delusions and their compensations through provings of the remedy. And that is the only standard we apply in homeopathy. The only standard we apply to separate truth from fiction. Now let's put it another way. The core delusion expresses the most important characteristic of the patient's totality. So, we can formulate another definition of the core delusion. That is the emotional or the spiritual center surrounded by a cluster of images or ideas which are the patient's compensations. And now if we continue to further define the core delusion, we will understand that the core delusion is the expression of the dominant ruling emotion. It will be the driving force behind the actions, thoughts and plans of our patient. And along the way, the core delusion creates secondary delusions. Now, let's focus on lachesis as a homeopathic remedy, and let's analyze this remedy through the perspective of the core delusion. Lachesis has a delusion that he is injured by his surroundings, and also the delusion that he is wrong. And when this situation is persistent, it will lead inevitably to secondary delusions, and we can see those. The delusion that he'll be sent to an asylum, and the delusion that his medicine is poison. So all these are expressions of a paranoid delusional state, which is a proof of further evolving pathology. And in the case of lachesis, it often ends in schizophrenia. Now, we have to understand that all compensations, all secondary delusions, have their origin within the core delusion. For example, a patient needing lachesis might be loquacious, might have religious fixations, he must meditate and, of course, increase sexual activity. And it is imperative for every one of us, because we all have core delusions, it's imperative to effect compensations which can be regarded as defense mechanism, which is aimed at fleeing from a negative core delusion or reinforcing a positive one. So the patient may create lots of compensations to avoid his fate, and yet ultimately he will have to face his core delusion at some point in his life. Even a good delusion, such as humility of others while he is great, and we have here Platina and Steffi Zegrier, that delusion is obviously bad for the person as it reflects a delusion of grandeur and impedes self-growth. And at this point, we must try to answer the question, how do we find the expression, how do we find the compensation closest to the core delusion, or better still, one that directly expresses the core delusion? And how do we avoid prescribing based on the compensations, based on the persona or the mask? And those prescriptions based on the persona or the mask, they're far removed from the core delusion. So once we have found, or think we have found, the core delusion or a compensation close to the core delusion, it is important to make sure that this is the basic, the primary delusion, by asking just one more why question. It is well known that in any behavioral situation, we should ask ourselves and we should ask our patient why. And I suggest you to ask 5 times. And each why working from the previous answer. And by the 5th why, maybe you'll get a hint of the emotional state of affairs that underlies the feeling or situation. All this will become evident. And you won't stop questioning too early when assessing your patient. If the patient decides to go back, for example, to an ex-boyfriend, this might at first sound like reconciliation, like a positive step. And it would not be taken into account in finding the simillimum. But upon further questioning, you may find out that the patient did not return because she thought breaking up was a mistake or because she still loved her old boyfriend. Instead, you find that the patient wants to go back because she felt lonely and craves attention, and that, for example, is an indication of pulsatilla. Or maybe the motivation was to exact revenge, to make up simply in order to break up that relationship, to have the last word. And that is a classic response of aurum. Let's suppose someone wants to go to graduate school, not because he wants to get ahead in life through education, but simply to earn the respect and love of his family. And if we ask here why, the delusion just pops up. It is, I'm not loved. And after our question why, the delusion transforms itself to I'm worthless, and then transforms itself into the delusion I never succeed in anything. And here we have remedies: aurum muriaticum natronatum, argentum metricum, anacardium, and burrita carbonica. And if the answer of the next why is, for example, because everyone criticized me, then we have the delusion he's criticized, which is a fixed idea that is not at all typical for the previously mentioned remedies. And if you ask again, why? How do you feel about this? And you're asking this in order to elicit the ruling emotion, and thus the core delusion, the patient might answer, I feel like a cripple. I cannot make any decision. And this statement can be translated into the delusions that he walks on his knees, or his legs are cut off. And that particular answer would confirm a prescription of burrita carbonica. And if at this point no further why can be asked, we can safely assume that we have arrived at the patient's core delusion, that is, one belonging to burrita carbonica. And although there is a person I'm talking about, although he thinks getting a degree will be a road to self-worth, he does not know that he has simply relegated his delusion that he is not loved to the unconscious, where it awaits its next opportunity to return. And if you don't ask sufficient number of whys, the patient will show you compensations far removed from the core delusion. And we will then be prescribing for the mask rather than the shadow side. Because the mask is formed by all these compensations. And prescription based on the mask will lead you to the selection of a simile. Because the mask is the simile and the shadow side is the similimum. And okay, just a Chinese proverb which expresses the same. Confucius says, to return to the root is to find the meaning, but to pursue appearance is to miss the source.